everyone. My name is Brendan O'Connor. My pronouns are he, him. I live in Flatbush, Brooklyn. I'm a freelance journalist and a member of the National Writers Union. And earlier this year, I published a book called Blood Red Lines, How Nativism Fuels the Right with Haymarket Books. Hi, Anthony. I wasn't expecting you to be on this call, but Anthony was my editor and helped me shape the book into something that I'm pretty proud of. In the fall, I am going into the geography PhD program at the City University of New York. And I am also a member of NYC DSA, but I grew up in Manasquan and Red Bank. So Central New Jersey DSA has a special place in my heart. Should I just dive into it, or is there anything else that you want to cover before we start the talk?
Oh no, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Cool. So I've been reporting on the far right and the nascent neo-fascist movements of our time since the end of the Obama administration, when I was a staff writer at Gawker. And since then, I've been pulling on a number of reporting threads that I had the opportunity to weave together into this book, which is an attempt to understand some of the forces arrayed against our movement for socialism and working class liberation. Specifically, I tried to sketch the contours of what I call border fascism. This is a term that I have borrowed or appropriated from scholarship on fascism's classical period in Italy, where it is used to describe the specific character of Mussolini's movement and regime in and around the city of Trieste, near the border with Yugoslavia. In my book, I use the term border fascism to describe a still emergent political phenomenon, which is developing in an uneven and unsteady way, but is nevertheless making its presence felt in, I think, a variety of different spheres, from the electoral and, at the level of the state in Donald Trump's campaign and administration, but then also at the level of grassroots movements and street formations like the Proud Boys, and then also in the form of stochastic terror that is carried out by individuals who have sort of more vague connections to a wider movement that may not be members of a formal organization, but nevertheless kind of swim in the same streams. So in both ideology and practice, I believe this phenomenon has precedence in the classical fascist period of the 30s and 40s. As socialists, however, it behooves us to understand both the internal discourses of our class enemies and the political conjuncture in which we find ourselves. That is to say, if we are experiencing a hegemonic crisis of neoliberal capitalism, we would expect to find a proliferation of oppositional ideologies challenging that hegemony, not only on the left, but on the right as well. And in fact, what we find in the various organizations, grouplets, and cultural formations that make up what I call border fascism is a ambivalent and complicated relationship to capitalism, but their opposition is primarily to the dominant progressive neoliberalism and not capitalism as such. As with their fascist forebearers, they ultimately serve the interests of, if not the ruling class as a whole, then significant fractions of it. As the Bulgarian communist Georgy Dimitrov put it in August 1935, quote, "The open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital," end quote. It's not sufficient to draw parallels to past movements or regimes, however. Each crisis of capitalism has its own dynamics, and the United States in the early 21st century is a very different kind of place than Germany or Italy in the early 20th century, with a very different history and occupying a different position in world imperialism, which itself is structured differently than it was a century ago. In appropriating this idea of border fascism, I want to acknowledge the influence and legacy of the classical fascist movements and regimes today, but also underscore that there are particular characteristics to contemporary neo-fascism that need to be reckoned with, namely the specific role that borders and the idea of borders plays in the construction of this ideology and political project. Obviously, in the US context, the border with Mexico is particularly important, but we are seeing the militarization of borders around the world, in Israel and Palestine, on the borders of the European Union, in Central and South America. This militarization of borders plays a key function in the way that nation states understand themselves at a time when the relationship between nation states and global capital is more fraught than ever. Activists and politicians within and adjacent to the Republican Party will talk about how the border is everywhere, or every state is a border state. This is used as a justification for the expansion of the border security apparatus, but it tells us something about the function of the border and its necessity to the maintenance of capitalist labor relations. Ultimately, the border is not just a place, but a political tool for managing workers. And in the United States, managing workers is always already about maintaining white supremacy and racial domination. That domination requires not only the mobilization of vigilante groups and fascist street gangs, but the translation of vulgar nativism and anti-immigrant racism, which has a long history and tradition in this country, into a political framework that can be adopted and implemented by the state. For an example of how this works, I focused in my book on the life and work of a man named John Tanton and his benefactor, Cordelia Scaife-May, who together founded and funded a sophisticated network of organizations, mostly based in Washington, D.C., that over the course of several decades have been able to shift the terms and limits of the discourse and conversation around immigration away from the liberalized framework of the post-civil rights era and towards a more ethno-nationalist framework, which is really a reversion to the way that people thought and spoke about immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, culminating in providing the policy and personnel for the 2016 Trump campaign and the subsequent Trump administration. So to discuss the history of this network, I am going to read from my book, from the second, I think it's the second chapter of my book. So I'm just going to take a sip of water. In the early 1940s, Detroit was home to both the anti-Semitic radio broadcaster Father Charles Coughlin, a fascist sympathizer, and the progressive integrationist United Auto Workers Union. Racial tensions in the city had been escalating for years. In one sweltering summer afternoon in June 1943, a fight between black and white Detroiters at a park turned into a brawl. For the 2 days that followed, police and white vigilantes swarmed through the city's black neighborhoods. 25 black people were killed, including 18 by police. Many were shot in the back. 2 years later, a young white family, the Tantons, moved out of the city, prefiguring the waves of white flight in the decades to come. Quote, "My parents decided that they'd had enough of the city," John Tanton, who was 11 years old at the time, would later recall. "I guess my father was ahead of the curve that way. He got sick of the city long before it was a common thing to do." Running a family farm was not an easy life, but young John Tanton found himself drawn to nature. "I was very much taken with the land," he recounted. "I love to garden and still do. I like to take care of the chickens and the turkeys and that sort of thing." A popular student and gifted athlete, he won a scholarship to Michigan State University, where he intended to study agronomy or soil science before switching to chemistry. He went on to medical school at the University of Michigan and became an ophthalmologist, but throughout he maintained an interest in issues of environmentalism and conservation, which in turn led him to the question of population. Quote, "I began to wonder how all these conservation problems were cropping up," Tanton recalled. "I became convinced, and I don't recall exactly how, that increasing numbers of people were part of the problem." Initially, Tanton, along with his wife, Mary Lou, looked to family planning organizations, setting up a Planned Parenthood clinic in northern Michigan, and talking to new mothers in the maternity ward of a local hospital about not having more children. "Women who have just had a child are usually highly motivated not to have it anymore for a while," Tanton remarked. Soon enough, he would begin looking for other tools of population control, toying with an idea he called, quote unquote, passive eugenics, and finding like-minded allies in organizations like Planned Parenthood and the Sierra Club. In 1970, Tanton's advocacy on issues of population control led him to a conference in Chicago, the Congress on Optimum Population and the Environment, where he met writers like Paul Ehrlich and Garrett Hardin, authors of The Population Bomb and The Tragedy of the Commons, respectively, as well as Willard Wirtz, who served as labor secretary to John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, and Hubert Humphrey, the former vice president. The connections he made to this part of the environmental movement would serve him well. Hardin would prove an enduring intellectual partner in the years to come, and Roger Connor, a liberal who Tanton met in the late 1960s while preparing for the first Earth Day, would become the first executive director of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which Tanton would establish nearly a decade later. He also soon connected with Cordelia Scaife May, a fellow amateur naturalist and avid conservationist. A seminal moment in Tanton's political development came in 1974, when he happened upon an advertisement in Science magazine for an essay contest hosted by the Limits to Growth Conference, supported by Texas oil man George Mitchell. While the essay he wrote would only come in third place, Tanton would identify it later as the first time he formalized his thoughts on the connection between conservation and immigration. The essay sounds many themes that would remain prominent throughout the rest of his life, including Tanton's belief that in advocating for greater limits on immigration to the United States, he was speaking truth to power, bravely giving voice to a controversial view that few would dare speak aloud. Quote, as the principal countries currently receiving immigrants, the United States, Canada, Australia, reach or surpass the limits of population which they support, they will likely move to curtail immigration, he wrote. As with the coming material equilibrium, we should ask whether this is a good or a bad thing. Is the end of significant international migration an evil to be deferred as long as possible, or could it be a benefit to be welcomed and encouraged with all deliberate speed? End quote. Likewise, Tanton voiced his longstanding concerns over the, quote, demographic implications of immigration. Migrants from the less developed countries bring their traditionally high fertility patterns with them, Tanton warned. This is another move away from stability. Tanton argued that an influx of migrants threatened the social consensus, the quote unquote unanimity of values and purposes, as he put it, necessary to meet, quote, the emerging qualitative environmental goals of developed countries. These are unlikely to be shared by the bulk of illegal immigrants who migrate looking for personal economic growth, he wrote. Immigration may be good for the vast majority of the migrants themselves. They may find economic opportunities, and in the special case of refugees, new freedoms. It emerges, however, that their migration in the main runs counter to the real interest of both the countries of origin and the recipient countries and the world as a whole, end quote. By the 1970s, the population control movement had gone mainstream. Paul Ehrlich, author of The Population Bomb, was a frequent guest on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Chapters of Zero Population Growth, the organization through which Tanton met Roger Connor, had sprung up around the country and were especially popular on college campuses. In 1975, Tanton would try and fail to push ZPG to take a more hardline anti-immigration position. The organization's leadership rejected Tanton's efforts, a former staffer said, because, quote, they were uneasy about getting into ethnicity. They didn't want to be called racist. Tanton and his allies, they said, talk in very legitimate terms about protecting our border and saving the nation's resources and so on. But the trouble is, after you've heard them, you want to go home and take a shower, end quote. Tanton's frustration with environmentalists' queasy response to his ideas about immigration led him to start building his own movement. I found virtually no one was willing to talk about this, he said. It was a forbidden topic. I tried to get others to think about it and write about it, but I did not succeed. I finally concluded that if anything was going to happen, I would have to do it myself. And so he did, although not entirely by himself. In the decades to come, Tanton cultivated a handful of wealthy benefactors, though none was more important to his work than Cordelia Scaife May, a lonely member of Pittsburgh's wealthy Mellon family. By 1979, Tanton had formed the Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR. The board of directors included several advocates who'd come out of the population control milieu, including Sidney Swensrud, former president and chairman of Gulf Oil, and William Paddock, an environmental activist who had introduced Tanton to May. In one 1983 memo, between anecdotes about him mocking Black women in labor and overweight people trying to fit into eye exam chairs, an aide notes that Tanton wants to, quote, get close enough to Cordy to become her advisor in a decade or so. Cordy was May's nickname. The relationship was a long and productive one. Just 2 years after expressing his desire to become May's advisor in 1983, Tanton described her as FAIR's single biggest supporter, followed by board member Swensrud, the former Gulf Oil chairman. The Mellon family held a controlling interest in Gulf Oil for decades. That relationship is pretty well under control, Tanton reported. His notes show that he was already thinking about how the childless scion would distribute her estate. Quote, John would become the one who would carry her legacy forward the way a son or a daughter would, Roger Connor, FAIR's former executive director, told the New York Times. John assured her what she believed in her life would carry on. In 2005, facing a terminal pancreatic cancer diagnosis, May asphyxiated herself with a plastic bag, leaving behind an $825 million estate. And the years that following her suicide filing showed the Colcom Foundation, which was May's primary funding vehicle toward the end of her life, received $441 million from May's estate and the Cordelia S. May Family Trust, another more opaque funding vehicle, as well as all of her personal property and more than 450 acres of real estate. Between 2006 and 2017, a decade span that saw unprecedented mobilization of migrant workers, comprehensive immigration reform was twice defeated in the US Congress, and the election of Donald Trump, May's Colcom Foundation poured approximately $138 million into the Tanton network, most of which would not have existed without her support in the first place. The bulk of that money went to FAIR, the Center for Immigration Studies, CIS, and Numbers USA, three of the biggest anti-immigration think tanks that Tanton either founded or nurtured. In the Trump administration, political appointees in almost every federal department that touched immigration, as well as a assistant secretary of state nominee, included Tanton network posts on their resumes. That's the end of me quoting from my own book. This was, again, the culmination of years of work. Between the 60s and the 80s, nativist politics was largely peripheral within the Republican Party, or at least only selectively mobilized, culminating in the Reagan administration's passage of major immigration legislation that coupled a so-called path to citizenship with increasing militarization of border enforcement. It was against this peripheral position that Tanton and his cohort were struggling. But in the 90s, with the accelerating restructuring of global capitalism after the fall of the Soviet Union, the increasingly free movement of capital necessitated the increasing restriction of movement for workers. And both political parties found it necessary to adopt, to one degree or another, nativist politics. There is a popular understanding of neoliberalism as a way of instituting austerity everywhere, selling off as much of the social state as possible. But it turns out that this is not actually the whole story. Looking at the past 40 years of neoliberalism, we see that the security state, the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the border industrial complex have all exploded massively. If you look at the financial filings of the businesses and the contractors that supply and profit from these state endeavors, they anticipate that these are all growing markets, that this isn't going anywhere anytime soon. In other words, in order to continue imposing austerity and the privatization of social services and selling off what remains of the welfare state for scraps, there has to be a massive repressive apparatus to discipline the increasingly desperate masses. As neoliberalism entered a period of hegemonic crisis, this process of privatization extended to that repressive apparatus. In 1988, Tanton had written to a friend Quote, by the year 2020, when everyone has become a minority, presumably the formation of a white political caucus, along with all the others, will be reasonable and justified. The fascinating question is, at what points between now and 2020 will this become reasonable? 4 years later, he wrote a prospectus for a new organization, the League for European American Defense, Education, and Research, which would serve as a, quote, socially acceptable umbrella organization to which persons of European ancestry can belong to defend and promote their common interests. The way Tanton described his political goals foreshadowed much of the reactionary rhetoric of our own time. Quote, Western traditions and culture are under siege, particularly in academia, but also by some other interest groups, which we see running down Western civilization as being to their advantage. In contrast, we see our heritage as something to be proud of and worthy of support. We wish to reaffirm our attachment to Western civilization. And again, quote, demography is destiny. Projections by the US Census Bureau show that midway into the next century, the current European American majority will become a minority. In many areas of the country, this change will come sooner or is already upon us. This is unacceptable. We decline to bequeath our children minority status in their own land, end quote. This is an important aspect of the neo-fascist dynamic in this period of crisis. Citizens, particularly white citizens, but not only white citizens, are given opportunities to feel that they are participating in protecting the sovereignty of the nation state, which in the settler colonial context of the United States is, again, always and already a racialized endeavor. This is the power and the threat that Trump really posed and continues to pose. But sometimes this can veer out of control, as it did on January 6th, when those who, quote, declined to bequeath their children minority status in their own land frontally attacked the state. This crosses a line, and it has provoked massive crackdown. The federal government was embarrassed by what happened and needs to reassert its legitimacy, its authority, and its monopoly on political violence, which is also in tension with and in contradiction with this historical pressure on that monopoly. I think that the future of this movement of border fascism is highly unstable and contingent. But my suspicion is that it will regroup and reform and find new articulations in both stochastic terror, like the massacre of the massage workers in Atlanta, and future attempts at contesting for state power. In any case, confronting this ideology requires forging what the German communist Clara Zetkin called an iron-like community of struggle of all working people in every sphere ruled by capitalism. Today, I believe this means continuing to build the DSA into a mass organization that can lead and support struggles on a variety of fronts, including backing immediate legislative reforms like the PRO Act and the For the People Act, not because passing these bills will automatically unleash socialism, but because they would change the terrain on which we are organizing. It is hard to envision a thoroughly anti-fascist abolitionist labor movement rising in this country under current conditions, but that is what we need if we are going to win socialism. It's not that unions are necessarily anti-racist or that union members are automatically inoculated against reactionary politics, far from it. But that working class organizations like unions and institutions can be wielded as weapons in class struggle, in the struggle for working class liberation, and as tools to dismantle the borders that limit and contain our political imaginations and what kinds of worlds we believe to be possible. And with that, I would love to open up for discussion. That wasn't the full 40 minutes, but there's a lot more I could have covered, but that's I'd love to hear from the crew.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was incredible. I think originally, Farai, you had a question also listed, and I see Ryan as well. So anyone who feels like they want to ask a question in the chat, they can type it out. like Brian had done, or they can type in stack. Let me see. Brian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's okay. Well, I suppose the question that I had, since I've studied fascism a bit, as I stated earlier, essentially, how I guess compare contrast is how I get is border fascism similar or different to, I guess, what could be referred to as apocalyptic social, not apocalyptic fascism, where essentially they are less about like just closing borders and more of they're the sorts of people who will go like basically they want race war now. That's I guess apocalyptic fascism. They want immediate race war. Some of them want the collapse of civilization for like groups like Adam Waffen. Basically those types, the like ultra violent like race war now types. Are those like different than the border fascists, or they go hand in hand with the border fascists?
Yeah, that's a great question. I in my sort of mental bestiary of all of these different tendencies and groups, I think that what you are describing as the apocalyptic fascists, I think that represents a kind of pull within the wider movement that exerts more or less influence depending on kind of the wider political conditions. And I think that this is something that has been an influential kind of idea and narrative in the far right in the U.S. for many years, even before our present moment. And I think that right now it is growing in influence in reaction to the state's crackdown that has followed January 6th, in reaction to Trump's loss in the election. And I frequently, I would say that this tendency is kind of summed up in the slogan, "There is no political solution." That there is an influential current that is trying to direct and radicalize disaffected Trump supporters and other more ideologically developed fascists towards towards an insurrectionist and apocalyptic worldview. But I don't think that this is dominant, and I don't think this is kind of constitutes its own separate movement, for the very simple reason that these are people who have, in this kind of proxy parasocial way, tasted state power and have seen someone who they believed to represent their interests and their political project in the White House. And the Republican Party remains a place of struggle, remains a party that, for so long as Donald Trump remains involved in it, the mass base for fascism will remain attached to the Republican Party, because why wouldn't it? Like, it is harder to argue that this is not a party that represents their interests than it does. And so that's why I think the future of these movements and these currents is kind of up in the air right now, because it's not clear at all to me how the tensions and contradictions of the party are going to resolve themselves.
This may technically be cheating, but with factor asking a second question, but is it possible there's a generational gap in the fascist movement? Because I was looking at the videos of the people who stormed the Capitol. Those were mostly older people, and those might fit under the border fascism definition. Well, and this is more of anecdotal, to be honest. From what I've seen online, a lot of the younger, I guess, fascists tend to be more of the apocalyptic type, where they're those parts where they love their skull masks and stuff.
Yeah, I do think that I do think that there's a generational tendency that the younger people who are drawn into these spaces tend to be drawn into this kind of accelerationist mode. Why that is, I think it's partly like, like younger people spend their time online in different digital spaces where, on Telegram and stuff like this, where these currents are already kind of hegemonic. But I would also say that there are groups like the Proud Boys that function as a kind of big tent umbrella organization that, where all of these currents kind of meet, and there is a like discursive exchange, and age-wise as well, there is much more variety. But you're right to say that, like in different historical moments, the movement looks different. And like, 20 something people 20-year-old fascists are not joining like 3%er militias. That's like that's a holdover from a different time. But they're still around. So like, it's not as though we can make very clean categorical distinctions, I think.
Ryan?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you thought that this sort of like QAnon phenomenon and the sort of like mystical framework that they have, if that may play into or possibly like interplay with like fascism in the United States, and if you think it might. Because one of the thoughts I had was that Nazism, one of the things that distinguishes it from fascism is that like mystical element. So one of my thoughts and fears was that the QAnon thing might sort of like, I don't know, like set the ground for like future Nazism. Do you agree with that, or what do you think?
Yes, I think that's already happening. I think that your apprehension is entirely correct, and that this, what in the function and the role of this kind of like esoteric mythologizing in like early Nazi formations,
Mhm.
I think there are like structural parallels, formal parallels with QAnon, which is really like a kind of like takes a lot of its narratives from a kind of evangelical like eschatology and like apocalyptic worldview, as we were just talking about. And so yes, I do think that I do think that the QAnon conspiracy theory will continue to mutate. I think that, and I think that, and I, and so do the fascists. Like they are actively trying to recruit disaffected and disillusioned QAnon believers into like see this as like a ripe field for radicalization, and even before the election, if you were to, I mean, I remember the first time I covered a Proud Boy rally out in Portland and seeing Q people there, and this was years ago, and now, it's not peripheral at all. It is flowing through the heart of this movement. So, how that, again, like, I'm not trying to like be a pundit and say like, here's what's going to happen, but that is absolutely a part of this story.
I just put myself on stack. Yeah, I have a couple questions, but I'm just gonna ask one for now. But this might be a tangent, but I still feel like it's, I don't know. When reading the book, like you mentioned a lot of the different sort of places like you went to, like these really sort of bizarre right-wing conferences, and going to these, like you just mentioned, going to these events and asking like questions to people. But yeah, so about the conferences, just out of curiosity, like how did you like prepare for those events? Because and how were people's reaction to you? Did they sort of, I mean, I'm guessing you went there with a press pass maybe, but like did people, I don't know, did they view you in a very antagonistic way? How did you prepare for those kind of like events, and what were you hoping to get from them going there? Yeah, so I mean that's like, I guess one general, like, yeah, so just if you want to talk about that, because to me that was really fascinating, just the sort of that point of view that you had in the book.
Yeah. So I always was identifiable as a member of the press. I did not, at no point would I kind of go undercover. I mean, the nice thing about being a writer is that, like, you're not carrying around like a big video camera or something. Like, you can keep sort of a low profile if you want to. You don't have to necessarily. And when approaching these kinds of things, whether it's a conference or a convention or a rally, generally my practice is not to try to confront people or kind of like debate and debate any of these people. I don't think that is like necessarily my role or my like what is the most useful thing. I think that what is instructive and useful is to kind of be present and listen toward like looking for an understanding of how these people understand their own activity and how they understand what they are doing and what are the stories they are telling themselves about their place in the world and what the meaning and significance is of the movements and the organizations that they are a part of. Which is not to legitimize those things per se, but to take them seriously in order to understand better their own internal contradictions and their own internal tensions, whether that is to then be exploited or taken advantage of or confronted in other ways, is a matter of democratic deliberation, like beyond the scope of my ability as an individual to be able to prescribe. Some different situations call for different tactics and different strategies. But so when I'm like moving through these spaces as a reporter, I'm not necessarily like waving the red flag, but depending on who I'm talking to and depending on how savvy they are, I have had interviews where people sort of realize like, like you're not just like some like mainstream liberal, like there's something else going on with you, because of I guess the nature of the questions that I'm asking. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I just was, yeah, I just felt like just curious about the balancing act and all. Yeah, and then for anyone else that have questions, I have a few more, but I want to also give other folks a chance to ask questions. I know Varaya, you had other ones maybe, but yeah, for anyone who wants to come stack, give it a second.
Can I?
Is Yoshi? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to ask a question. My question is, what do you think is the challenge right now to speak to people's lived experience and then like also help them to explore new ways of interpreting their reality? Because one of the things that I think at first confused me is like, why would the Republican Party and the Trump Party, let's be honest, that's like one and the same now practically, embrace like conspiracy theory? Like, what is to be gained from believing in disinformation? But then it struck me that the fact of the matter is, like, we all tell ourselves stories, and this country, the United States, tells itself stories in order to bend the people within its sovereign borders under its control. And I feel like that's the challenge, like going forward, in order to combat the resurgence of explicit racism, like, because that racism was always here in the formation of this country.
Yeah, I think that's very astute, and I agree that the role of narratives and the role of stories as a way of giving people a kind of framework to understand their own lives and their own experiences is really important. And I do think that the QAnon conspiracy theory, and again, kind of I think we can't underestimate the influence of sort of fundamentalist Christian narratives about good and evil, and how many people in this country believe that they are engaged in a like spiritual struggle against literal demons. This is very powerful. Like, if this is what you believe about how the world works, that is a very powerful thing. Fortunately, as socialists, we also have a very powerful story, but it is not necessarily a story that people can automatically internalize simply upon hearing it. It is something that has to be experienced, and this is the role of struggle. Like, I don't really, part of the reason why I am not interested in like debating fascists is because I'm like pretty at best ambivalent about the role of like one-to-one persuasion. Like, I think people learn through struggle, for better or for worse. And so the task before us is in building the kinds of organizations that can bring people into struggle and bring people into the kinds of struggles that restructure their way of understanding the world, to see that, to experience the power and the transformational power of solidarity with other members of the working class. And that is something that can kind of supersede, I think, other existing narratives. This is maybe a slightly idealistic, or maybe like overly romantic view. And obviously, like, this is like an uneven thing, and there's like always going to be pitfalls, but that, it seems to me, is that's our kind of responsibility.
Jessica, and then Brian.
Thanks. Hi. My question is, and you really caught my attention with kind of like not believing in sort of the one-to-one, like convincing someone in a one-to-one discussion. One-to-one is such a part of our organizing, tradition, one-on-one conversation. So, but my question is really then, you're talking about struggle and sort of class struggle and material struggle and tying it in, but I so often see, right? Poor white males, for example, right? These are the people who, that struggle is completely weaponized against them in a way, right? Like they're not cognizant of it. And a lot of times their anger and the impetus for a lot of what they do is because of those material struggles. And I'm just wondering, like, that seems like, right, the opportunity where if you could talk to someone one-to-one, right? And you could kind of sort of explain like, the structure and the system and where they're being exploited and that kind of thing. You would think that would work, but you seem to be kind of saying that's kind of idealistic. So I'm just wondering more of like what you're going into a little bit about, sort of getting people to understand the material or the struggle.
Yeah. So, okay. So I'm like maybe being a little bit provocative, and I appreciate you, appreciate you calling me in. I like, I spend plenty of time doing one-on-one conversations with people in my organizing. I think what I'm trying to get to is that, like, that in order to be victorious, like a kind of like mass politics is necessary. But so, I mean, like, yeah, in the case of, in the case of let's say, exploited white men who have a kind of false understanding of the source and the nature of their oppression. Yeah, I do think that there's no doubt that there is value in like talking to people, and I definitely think that that is how we build relationships and kind of engage in like this social aspect of organizing. But to me, it seems like it's not, or I guess what I should really say is that it's like necessary but not sufficient, and that the critical part of what it seems to me kind of brings people into kind of like a new understanding of the world that like it is, brings like a thorough transformation of the way that they understand things, is experiencing a collective struggle. Whether that ends in defeat or victory is almost immaterial. I mean, obviously, like, defeats can lead to demoralization and disaffection, but often, I think I have experienced this where, like, various organizing projects didn't end the way that we had hoped, but people still, like, were transformed by them. And it seems to me that, like, that is the place where someone who has a kind of who is, embedded in kind of ruling class ideas about society, like, can be brought into the struggle for liberation, and not just for other people's liberation, but for their own. But I think that I guess what I mean when I say, like, I don't really believe in the power of, like, of like persuasion, is that I guess what I'm really saying is that, like, we're not going to, like, rhetoric our way to victory, and we're not going to, like, convince people that, like, socialism is the answer to their problems. Like, people have to come to see that for themselves, and so our task is, like, to put them in a position to be able to see it for themselves. That's I think that's maybe a little bit closer to what I'm really trying to say.
Thank you.
Brian?
Yeah, well, actually, before I get to my question, I would like to comment, because I remember I overheard something being said about how we can't rhetoric our way to victory. And to be fair, with fascism, that actually, I do have to agree with that statement, because from what I've interacted with fascist individuals, they really don't care about basically the rhetoric that would be used kind of would not work with them, because they live practically in a different reality, and they kind of don't really care about the same stuff we do. So that wouldn't, for many of them, especially the hardcore ones, that won't work. Some of them can be brought over, but some of them I don't think so. But I was going to ask, how do how can we convince, I guess, liberals and centrists about the severity of this problem? And particularly, even if they are convinced about, how do we get them to do anything? Because I've met more than one person who they will agree with me, but they admit, I just can't deal with politics. They just tell me, like, I can't attend the meetings, I can't go to events. Like, this just gives me a headache. It gives me, basically, they mentioned that they can't psychologically stomach it, or they don't, or they want to trust in the system more than I'm comfortable with. For example, like, they argue that, like, they're really against any idea of militant activity. They're really against, they want to rely more on, I guess, the state to take care of it, and they really don't want to get involved with political activity at all. So I guess, how do we deal with the fact that most people are the apolitical types?
Great question. I think if anybody knew the silver bullet answer to that, then we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. I mean, I will say also that, like, I have even had a somewhat uneasy relationship to my own like diagnosis of the nature of the political crisis and the fact that there is a what I believe to be a developing fascist movement in this country that because this rhetoric was mobilized in the election as a way of, I mean, Joe Biden like announced his campaign using footage from Charlottesville. Like, Joe Biden doesn't give a fuck about Charlottesville. Let's be fucking real. Like, but no, I shouldn't. I mean, like, I don't know, like, who knows what Joe Biden gives a fuck about? But like, my point is that the kind of theories of fascism, which can be mobilized to reinforce the power of establishment liberalism. And what I had tried very hard to do in my work and in this book is to demonstrate that, in fact, it is the contradictions of liberalism that give rise to this in the first place. And so, like, liberals do not have the answer to this. But to your point, like, people are not always ready to hear that. People don't always want to hear that. Some people, will want to just throw up their hands and trust that, that DHS will be able to crack down on domestic terrorists. And how do we respond to that? How do we overcome that? I don't know that there's a universal answer, because I think that the way that we respond to that depends on the class position of the person that we're talking to. If that is an answer that you are getting from a coworker, like, I would say that it's almost less important to try to convince them of like the immediate necessity of like XYZ piece of legislation expanding the security state is bad. It's probably more important to like talk to them about, all right, so you're not interested in talking about politics like at the level of like national, like whatever's going on with the federal government, like that's fine. Like, what's going on in your life?
Well,
Like,
typically it's fellow students who I hear this from.
okay, so, but I guess, so what I mean to say is that like, we have to think about how to politicize and radicalize people using the things that they do care about, rather than convincing them to care about something that is like more abstract to them, and like getting them to a place where
the thing is, for example, I knew a lady and she runs a club, and she was trying to encourage people to get involved with like COVID relief projects, and I was trying to forward basically the COVID, I mean our mutual aid project, like, hey, here's another resource. And she basically admitted that she didn't want to touch something like that because it had political implications. It's literally a case of, if it has political implications, they want hands off. Like,
yeah, I mean, that's tough. I think that it's a matter of building trust and building relationships and not giving up. Like, somebody might say that it's okay, so like, they might say that they don't want to touch something that has political implications, but like, they are already doing something political. And so being kind of involved in that and finding the ways to make the political content of that activity explicit, like it might not be the idea that you bring into it. Like you might have to find it in the guiding.
Unfortunately, the understanding we have of politics and the understanding, like, I guess the average person has of politics, where I guess in reality, is there more of anti-ideological, maybe is the best way to describe it?
Can I intervene a little bit? Because I think what I saw Sebi posting a really interesting comment that I was also in agreement with. I think based on what Brendan's saying about, because to be honest, what I've seen happen mostly is kind of what, there's the front face, there's the thing that people say, and then there's the deeper reality of just most often people having a lot on their plate. Now, for those who might be really apolitical, maybe their class position is where they don't necessarily have to, care as much about certain things. If I hear that now, then it really says something about the person, in my opinion. Not anything bad, just that if you're not getting touched in some way by what's going on, and I have tons of friends who are liberal, centrist folks, I would argue, but even nowadays, their main concern is like, well, I'm done with that. I'm just tired. I voted for Biden, and I'm just like, where's my check? And this is just really weird, and I'm just gonna do my thing. And I think like what Sebi, I want to read what they wrote. I feel like it's even harder, though, when someone has a good reason. Like I met a Black sex worker. Sex workers are too busy trying to survive to want to get involved, especially when they would be the most targeted. And I think that kind of is something that it's complicated, right? But that's something I've seen, actually. Not necessarily people saying they're not interested in politics because they don't, I don't know, like they're just so removed. It's more like they're either overworked, tired, very cynical maybe because of the options that are there. And I'm including people who are Democrat voters too. I'm not talking about folks who are really out there and not caring at all. I'm talking about people in my family and friends. So that's something, and I just wanted to read Sebi's comment because I think that's interesting. I'm going to read Curtis's too. Yeah, you got to show for people again and again, and they might hear you. Connect capitalism to problems they're already upset about, right? And this is like one thing that we do at our chapter. Aisha, our co-chair, and Jorge, another organizer, for the last month have been leading these really interesting trainings. And in those trainings, you learn about how to ask those pertinent questions to get someone to, because people have a gripe, connect that gripe to something that takes time to develop over time as well. It is hard work. And again, there's, like you said, there's no universal solution. Frankly, there's many instances where people just drop out. That's fine. But I do think there is levels to this that that could be always peeled away. But I just want to get also, I'm sorry, Ryan, for I just wanted to intervene because I do think this is like something that's like a big puzzle for any of us to figure out. But yeah, Ryan, do you want to ask your question? And we have about, oh, sorry, I just want to say we're at 3:40 right now, so I would argue maybe ask we would be open for maybe like one question more because I already know Brendan, thank you so much for your time. I don't want to keep you on too long. But yeah, like if anyone else has a question, feel free to ask it now. But first, yeah, Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, this was just going off of what we were talking about, and it's kind of like a very direct question. Do you think that there is an anti-fascism without socialism?
Not a meaningful one.
Yeah.
Like, I think that yeah, no, I mean, like, no, not really.
That's fair.
Yeah. I think that liberals, like, the anti-fascist struggle, like, can be a way of radicalizing liberals. Like, it's not to say that, like, if you are a liberal, like, just like don't show up. Like, no, but I mean that the anti-fascist struggle has to be socialist. Otherwise, because like like the anti-fascist struggle has to be socialist, because the struggle for socialism is a struggle for a world in which the conditions that give rise to fascism don't exist in the first place. So like otherwise, like we're just going to have to keep fighting the fascists. Like,
Socialism is the most effective anti-fascism, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that would be, yes, that's my theory anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Awesome. Yeah. Any final questions or comments anyone has? And great questions, by the way, everyone. I think this kind of discussion is really complicated because we are facing an enemy that's very complicated too. I think in the book, I was struck by just the weird, like you also write about this like multiracial or multiculturalism version of right-wing politics. Is, you know, to face it, like we're not facing an enemy that's own. There's white supremacy woven in, but there are, like, say, men of color involved in leading the Proud Boys and other things. And I find, you know, all those different connections very complicated, but necessary to also piece through. Because like you said, they're not even saying they're white supremacists. They're talking about themselves as Western chauvinists. So we have to be more, but it's all connected to that, to property rights and all. So I just think the book is very valuable in enforcing us to be more specific when we are maybe confronted with folks who want to know more or are confused or may fall to the propaganda, not necessarily believing it wholeheartedly, but might say things like, well, how can this be racist? You know, or confused about that. So I think that, you know, the book does a really good job of piecing that together. And it's really complicated. So it's really complicated. I just wanted to make that comment because I think that is really important to remember too. Because the Proud Boys, yeah, they're not just white dudes. There's, like, you know, black and brown men in it, and yet they're still racist because they still talk about immigrants and are not talking about Norwegian immigrants or Scandinavian or whatever. They're talking about folks who are racialized as brown. It's super complicated, but like you said, we fight that with socialism. Brian, you have the last question.
Yeah, no one else seems to be going, so I might as well take advantage of this to ask one more of my 10,000 questions. Apologies to hog up the spotlight like this, but I was going to ask, this may seem a bit like weird or off topic, but is there any place for, I guess, the anti-fascist struggle online? Because I noticed that online recruitment, especially amongst youth, is how a lot of youth have gotten recruited to the movement. So is there any, like, place for this struggle online? Or I guess what's your take on, like, I guess, the online sphere of things?
Yeah.
Sorry if that's kind of broad.
It is broad, but it is an important question. And I don't really know that I have a very good answer. I would say that what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years is that that like deplatforming and shutting down payment processors and stuff like this is very effective at disrupting these groups' ability to organize, to spread propaganda. The infiltration of private online spaces by anti-fascists who then will dump Discord logs, not only gives us useful information about the groups themselves, but sows distrust and discord, so to speak, within them because means that they don't trust each other, these kinds of things. So yes, the internet and online is a important terrain to struggle on. I am, however, increasingly skeptical that online is a place where a kind of positive political imagination can be, or like a positive political movement can be built. I think that it's basically a place where, like, at best we can achieve like defensive victories. And there's defensive victories are important. Like, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I don't know. I guess my thoughts on that are still I guess evolving. But the short answer to your question is yes. Like, it is important, and we can't cede anywhere, any space to our class enemies, especially not it is part of the public sphere, and so, like, fascists have to be denied access to the public sphere and forced underground. We also have to understand that in forcing them underground, we kind of change what they are and what they're going to do, and that it's not without consequence. They don't just go away. But yeah, I don't know. I like I said, I don't really have I don't have like a solid answer to your question, but I do think it's an important one. And so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do think, again, like, having read the book and everything, there is a lot of complexity and connections that you make, both, like you said, through the history of this guy Tanzin, which is utterly insane. Like, just to know, like we talked before about just how it is always capitalism, like, setting the stage for people with lots of money to fund crazy projects. So that's always a thing. But then there's all this, weird moments too, of this guy named Stanton, who's happened. I think you even said, like, he's really good at begging for money, and that's his skill. But just crazy to think, with these people involved, now we're living with this insane political universe where, yeah, even with Biden in charge, you still have people talking about invasions and deluge of immigrants and such and such and such. And it's just like, we still have these camps, right, where young kids are still kept, and it's just like they're going to get sick, their kids are going to lose their mind. It's just, yeah, it's a very complicated narrative to talk about. And I think you also raise a lot about, like you said, the liberal complicity in this. Like, this isn't just something that right-wing people do necessarily. This is something that liberals have done, including, say, under Clinton to Obama, etc. Yeah, so I think we're rounding out. Mariah, you said you have one more question to ask. Is it a short one?
Mainly it was just, how do we get around the fact that, well, the ways the right wing achieve success, we can't, because we can't get things like big money donors. We'll never have like the media or financial resources the right wing does. Regardless of what the crazy right wingers believe about George Soros, we don't actually have billion-dollar backers. So I guess, how do we get around that? And
Was there another part to that question?
no, it's just something that actually never mind.
Okay. I mean, this is why we need a mass movement of workers and oppressed people. Like, and not just because we need like the bodies in the street. Like, yeah, like, we're never gonna get a billionaire funder, but like, people can materially contribute to the organizations that they are part of. Like, there's a reason that unions need dues.
It feels like a chicken and egg problem almost, because it's like we don't have the media and financial resources that would help with getting the masses behind us, and we can't get that until we get the masses behind us. So
yeah, I mean, like, this is the role of people who have like an ideological commitment to this project, is that like we're gonna have to like make some we have to sacrifice our time and give our labor to get to that point. And it's not going to happen overnight. Like, this is people spend their lives in this movement. So like,
just forget what I said.
No, I think it's an important question for sure. No, yeah, I do think the one thing we do have an advantage, to be honest, is the numbers game. Like, to be like, the whole point of what we do is trying to tap into working people, working class people. The fact of the matter is, even with neoliberalism being such a shit show as it is, it's affecting even, say, middle class white folks even now. I mean, right now, of course, that's, these are folks who've been told that they'd be safe from these kind of things. So that's why you see them kind of panicking and responding to politics in a more extreme right-wing way. But that doesn't mean there aren't more people who would honestly, out of their own need to survive, would start to turn and look for alternatives. Now, the question is, what alternatives are there? And that's why we need a robust left with labor, because we want to be there because it's a complicated swing. It's not like crisis does not beget socialist change, but crisis does afford opportunity. And at the same time, we have to organize to get that. And we have enough people to do that. I mean, it's sad, but it's true. Like, things are so fucked that, like, literally, what does even normal mean when we're supposedly going back to, when COVID, like, you're talking about rent, like the work that we do at this chapter. It's like people are going to be losing a lot. And I feel like the question is, like, how are we going to be ready to give people that kind of alternative narrative? Going back to what Yoshi said about stories too, giving that alternative that explains why they are in the position they're in, but also take things off their plate. And I think it's also what Carissa mentioned earlier about, holding space for maybe, feeling frustrated again about how people are not moving at the same pace one would want. But also, I'm talking about people like as our coworkers, as having that sense of solidarity and love for them to grow, and also tying them in a way that shows that it's a material investment. It's not just, you should care about this because it's going to help someone else necessarily. It's twofold. It's like, help someone else, but you also would benefit from living in a world where literally ICE isn't going after people you care about, or that kind of stuff. So, any final comments, Brendan? And then, again, thank you so much.
No, I thank you for inviting me to speak and for the really thoughtful questions. I appreciate it.